All right, so we're just going to get centered and set some kind intentions for our time here together. So if you can get comfortable, I invite you to take a few deep cleansing breaths and let out an audible sigh. And I'm going to start and end the meditation with a chime. If comfortable, close your eyes and gently rest your awareness on feeling all of the subtle sensations of breath, wherever it is easiest for you to feel this. Allow the body and mind to relax and be still and comfortable. All thoughts about the past and the future and the present, just allow them to run in the background of your awareness and leave them alone for right now. All we are concerned about is the sensations of breath. Allow the body and mind to settle. Scan the body and notice any places where there's tension or tightness, and just invite those areas to relax and soften. And if they don't relax or soften, it's okay to be okay with that as well. And then gently reflect on your reasons for being here tonight. How is your being here an act of love and compassion for yourself and all life? Learning how to be more effective and protect our planet, protect native lands, protect our water. It's really skillful that we're here tonight. And just tap into that love and that compassion that drives you to be a defender of all life. May our time together be one of healing, growth, play, joy, and service. May we learn how to relate towards each other in a way that allows all of us to get our needs met. May our thoughts, words, and deeds honor and dignify all of the life present and all of the life not present. And may we have the wisdom to honor the dignity of those who, in their confusion, do great harm to people, animals, and the planet. May we show them compassion and model for them how to move through the world with love. Having set some loving intentions, we now do our native land acknowledgement. I'm coming to you from Lakeville, Minnesota, on lands cared for by the Dakota people for generations. The Boundless Love Project stands in solidarity with Indigenous peoples' efforts to protect their cultures, communities, and lands. This is why the Boundless Love Project's leadership opposes Enbridge's expanded Line 3 tar sands pipeline, which violates Indigenous treaty rights and threatens Indigenous communities who depend on the wild rice beds that Line 3 will likely destroy. May all Indigenous people, all non-Indigenous people, all animals, and all lands be safe and protected, peaceful and happy, healthy and strong. May we joyfully work individually and together to create a global beloved community where all life thrives. Thank you so much for everyone. And we're going to be talking about how people can get more involved later, but stopline3.org is the go-to place for getting involved with the Stop Line 3 movement. Next slide. For those of you who showed up late, we are video and audio recording this training to post to the web so others can benefit from it. So just be advised. Next slide. And I'm going to talk over, so basically what we're going to do tonight is we're going to start with some invitations. I'm going to introduce myself, and then we're going to have a presentation on strategy, power, and the 6 principles of direct action. About 80 minutes in, we're going to have a break where people can, turn off their screens and just decompress for a bit. And then we're going to come back, finish the presentation, go into Q&A, and then do closing, and then a bump out session, which will happen after the event is over, where people can mingle and talk and connect and look into creating affinity groups that they can work from. Next slide. So our invitations for you tonight are to be present. All participation is consensual. So when we invite you to participate in a certain way, just do what makes sense for you, given your situation. Take care of yourself. There is some information and pictures that might be triggering. So I will have content warnings beforehand. And if you need to turn away or turn off your sound for a slide or two, feel free to do that as what's appropriate for what your needs are. And if possible, I would love it if you could keep your cameras on. It helps me better relate to people as human beings. So that would be great. And then also if you can exaggerate your supportive nonverbal communication, that also works well too. For example, if something's being said that you really agree with and resonate, a twinkle fingers is good, a nodding of the head, a smile, that's awesome. If you are applauding something, you can do ASL applause. If you are feeling compassion for someone, you can put your hands on your heart. If you are having a hard time hearing, you can put your hands behind your ears. Let us know that you're having some technical issues. And any other way that we also do votes sometimes, thumbs up, thumbs down. Could go either way, that's helpful. So with COVID, it's very often like we're lacking a lot of communication and interaction. So if tonight could be as communicative and interactive as possible, it's great. And that helps me if you have your screens on so I can see you. But I understand some of you are at home and this is your family time and you need to do other things. So do what works for you. Awesome. Next slide, please. I also want to make it really clear that we intend no judgment of you, any activist, or any person. All activists and people deserve our respect, appreciation, and love, and I see them all as family. So I want to make a clear distinction between judgment versus discernment. And in judgment, we're looking at people, we're degrading them, we're devaluing them, we're saying that their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness don't matter. And there's often a sense of wanting to punish or harm that person. Whereas discernment is where we offer constructive criticism to ourselves and to other people in the movement about, hey, what worked here, but how could we tweak this situation to make it better, to be more effective, to be more strategic moving forward? And it in no way, it absolutely recognizes that individual's value, their dignity, their worth, and it supports that, and it trusts them enough to say, hey, I know together we can be even more effective, more powerful. So I hope people keep in mind that we're trying to use discernment here, and we're trying to respect all the dignity and worth and value of all human beings. And we're not trying to do judgment. But if, so that's our intention, and we're going to do our best, but sometimes language can be pretty difficult. Oh, I'm sorry, if you could go back a slide, Buff. Buff, can you go? Yeah, thank you. So be open-minded and curious. There's going to be a lot of information tonight, and we want you to do your best to just kind of set aside all of your preconceived notions and just be open and present, trying to hear what's being said, and use what you find helpful. And you can set aside what's not useful. Don't get hung up on if you hear something and it's jarring and it's preventing you from focusing, just set it aside. Remember your loving intentions for being here tonight, and try to remain open-minded and curious. And then ultimately, you're responsible for what you do with this information. Sometimes, if you leave here and you engage in civil disobedience or some form of direct action, you need to take responsibility for those actions, and we can't do that for you. So be responsible with your actions and use this information in what way makes sense given your situation. Next slide, please. So a little bit about myself to let you know who the presenter is. My name is Freeman Wicklund. I'm the mindfulness teacher with the Boundless Love Project. I use they, she, or he pronouns. I'm queer, queer man, and I prefer queer even though I'm gay because I feel like that's more inclusive and represents my family sort of relationship with all of my LGBTQ plus siblings and friends. And, another thing about me is I have electromagnetic hypersensitivity disorder. This is an invisible disability, and it makes it hard for me to actually go out in public these days because cell phone signals, radio signals, things like that cause me a lot of brain fog, and it causes me a lot of pain, and it causes me a lot of exhaustion. So when I do that, I end up having to spend 1 to 4 days in bed. And so I'm really sad. It limits the way that I can engage with the Line 3 movement, but I'm very thankful that one of the ways I can do that is through these trainings. And so I'm so happy and thankful that you've come out here tonight and are here to listen and learn. I've been involved in activism for over 30 decades now, or 30 years, 3 decades. And most of it has been on queer issues, environmental issues, social justice issues, peace issues, the whole gamut. But I would say that the majority of it has also been in animal protection issues. Next slide. So the next 2 slides will show cruelty to animals, and I mentioned being violated by the police. And the 3rd slide has an animal in distress. So next slide. I've actually been arrested 13 times for acts of civil disobedience, or let's just say for protesting. My first arrest was at the Higgins Pigeon Shoot in Higgins, Pennsylvania, and I got the spelling of Higgins wrong on this slide. But what happened at that one is I had to jump 2 fences while being chased by numerous law enforcement, run in front of loaded guns, and rescue pigeons who were inside these little cages where they were going to release them to be shot. And that was my first arrest. There was maybe 100 of us that got arrested that day. Every single one of us was strip searched by the police officers, and they did this in an effort to humiliate, degrade, and punish us. We were able to sue them and win our lawsuit for that. Because it was extra legal. But this is the type of sacrifices we need to make when we are struggling for a righteous cause. Next slide, please. One of the other things I did was a lot of undercover investigations, and we organized the first open rescue of animals from a factory farm in Le Sueur, Minnesota. This is the Michael Foods egg farm. We documented the conditions of the animals there. We took out sick and injured animals. We got them veterinary care and took them to a sanctuary where they could live out the rest of their life. Next slide. And here we are, here's me rescuing Lois, one of the hens. And even though this was very illegal, like we definitely were trespassing, we stole property, if you can consider a life in those terms, and probably violated some other laws, and yet I was not arrested for this. So there is many other times I've engaged in direct action and risked arrest and not been arrested. And a lot of it had to do, in this situation, we were very nonviolent, very peaceful, and there was a concern by the opponents that if they arrested us, it would only bring more attention to this issue and expose the conditions these animals are raised in. Next slide, please. So this man, Gene Sharp, he's the author of a 3-volume series, The Politics of Nonviolent Action and Waging Nonviolent Struggle. And I can't say enough about how much this man's work has changed my life for the better. So as an activist, my early years, I was very much a by any means necessary. And I would go to nonviolence workshops and I would say, yeah, prove to me that this works, because there's something about it that I resonate with. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if it wasn't effective, I didn't care. And almost all of the nonviolent workshops I went to was about sort of morality and spirituality and not effectiveness. And so I was like, well, this is all great. I love it. Do what you can, but it's not for me. And then I went to a Round River Rendezvous, which is a Earth First gathering. And there was an activist by the name of Michael Jackable there. And he had read Gene Sharp's work, and he did this 2-hour training, which was the first time I'd heard anyone talk about nonviolence in a strategic way. And it made me interested enough to actually go out and read those books, which I still have copies of. This is one of the 3 books. They're pretty heavy. I would actually recommend his latest version one, which is Waging Nonviolent Struggle. And those are also in our resources list that we will email you. But anyway, I read it, it changed my life. And we're tonight, yep, let's go to the next slide. And tonight we're going to be talking about the strategy behind direct action. And when we do this, there are, so part of my interest in strategy was not only, I did a lot of reading in nonviolence, I also read a lot of military strategy books. And one of the things you learn in military strategy is that there are specific levels of decision-making, strategic levels of decision-making, they're called. And we'll just quickly go through them. The top level is policy. This is where you set your goals, which we have as stopping line 3. The weapons system, which could be conventional or guerrilla warfare or nonviolent advocacy. The sacrifices we're willing to endure. Are we willing to volunteer our time, donate money, risk arrest, risk injury, risk death? The more sacrifices we're willing to make, the more power we have. So these are all policy level decisions. The next level is operational plan. What's the mechanism of victory? How are we going to win? And we're going to talk a little bit more about those options later. What's the plan? How are we going to leverage our resources to actually make the win happen? So we're trying to get Enbridge to give up on line 3 or get Governor Walz or some other administrator to stop it, or politician. Then we have strategy, tactics, and logistics. Strategy is how we allocate resources within the movement. Are we going to put our movement towards education, raising awareness, lawsuits, monitoring the line, protests, direct action? We've got limited resources. How are we going to give them, share them amongst all these things we need to do? And then tactics looks at our decisions regarding specific encounters with the opposition. Is this encounter going to be a protest? Are we going to hang a banner? Are we going to do a hard or soft lockdown? Are we going to have a hard or soft blockade? Those are tactical decisions. And then the logistics are the specific details of how to do and implement those important tactics. What are the signs going to say? What's our message going to be to the press? Who is going to make and bring the signs to the demo? Those are all logistical concerns. And in a lot of the strategy trainings you go to, they're going to focus on those 3 lower levels: strategy, tactics, and logistics. Very rarely do we ever have a topic on the policy and operational plan. And so that's what we're going to be getting today. We're going to learn about those strategies. And the reason this is important, next slide. The reason that's important is because we need to keep the lower levels of strategy subordinate to the higher levels of strategy. And when we do this, this helps our actions become focused, powerful, and effective. Otherwise, the lower levels will actually hamper our success. And so you don't have to remember everything on that last slide, other than we just need to understand what the upper levels are telling us so that we can then change and make the lower levels more appropriate. It'll still make sense by the end of the talk, don't worry. Next slide. So let's talk power, because this is what struggle is all about. Who has power and how do we wield it to get the gains that we are wanting? Now, with Enbridge, here we have the sources of power for Enbridge. And we can think of having 6 pillars that support Enbridge's power. And those are laid out here. The first one is authority or legitimacy. And these 6 structures of power come from Gene Sharp. Authority or legitimacy is Enbridge's ability to get people to willingly and voluntarily follow their leadership. This includes public support and the support by politicians that Enbridge has throughout Minnesota. It also includes the regulators that they're working with, like the Public Utilities Commission, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and all of those organizations that provide them for their permits. So this is about people. This is about their relationships with people and people cooperating and working with them to get done what they want to do. Next, we move on to human resources. These are the number of people who obey, cooperate, or provide Enbridge with some kind of support. And again, this includes all of their employees, and to the extent that they obey and cooperate with them, the public and governmental officials. So it's very similar to authority, but with human resources, they pay a lot of employees to do what they want, and those employees may not actually think of them as having authority. They may not voluntarily do it. They're just doing it for the money. So they tap into more resources in this power, but again, it's really based on people. Then we go to skills and knowledge. And this represents all the skills and knowledge that their human resources contain to help them get what they want. This includes the engineers who build the pipeline, the lawyers who get them their permits, their public relations departments that help to greenwash the company and make people think like this is something they want to do. And then we've got intangible factors, and these represent psychological and ideological factors that contribute to their power, such as cultural understandings about property rights and free market capitalism. This also represents the degree that their workers feel a larger mission to their cause. Like, is Enbridge something they rally behind? Is Enbridge doing good work in the community that they're really proud of? You know, so those are like intangible factors. They're psychological. And again, it's sort of how does it motivate the people who are working for them? And then you have material resources. This is the money and land and material resources that they have. And this is the one that probably least is related to people, but actually, if you think about it, you know, we have all these divestment campaigns trying to get banks to stop investing in fossil fuel companies. And so really their money also deals with a lot of relationships, because if we can effectively sever those relationships between Enbridge and the banks that support them, they won't have the money to do these large billion-dollar infrastructure projects for fossil fuels. So in a way, it also comes back down to people, even in this category. And then sanctions represents the police and the private security groups that are going to be able to punish anyone who doesn't follow along with Enbridge's plan. So that's going to be us. Us protesters are going to be facing sanctions and forms of repression, you know, getting arrested, going to jail, pepper spray in the eyes, whatever it may be. Those are the sanctions they can do. They might even file frivolous lawsuits at us to try to suppress our voice, to make us meek, and to make us finally obey their demand to just let them do what they want. So these are the 6 sources of power. But again, even with sanctions, we see that people are the ones who give, you know, who make the sanctions happen, the police, the private security teams, etc. Next slide, please. So key points to take away from all of that, if you don't remember anything else, just know that most power comes from people. And this helps identify our opponent. Most power comes from people, so that's important. The second thing to remember is that we can use these 6 sources of power to identify our opponent's sources of power and figure out which are most vulnerable to nonviolent attack. And this helps us strategize how to undermine their sources of power. And yes, this PDF will be available after the presentation. So Aaron, we will send this out to everybody. So don't feel like you have to take notes on this. Good question. Next slide. We can also evaluate stop line 3's sources of power as well. How much authority and legitimacy do we have? And a lot of this comes down to how well we are maintaining nonviolent discipline. And how, how honorable do we seem? How much character do we have? Are we ethical? Are we honest? Are we open about what we're doing? Are we for the public good? These are things that people look at with us to determine whether we have authority and legitimacy. Because if we're just working for our own ends, or it looks like we have an ego, like we want to be the saviors of the world, and so we're out there to raise a ruckus, but it seems very egoic, people are less likely to voluntarily obey us, voluntarily get involved in our movement, and help us out. So it's important that we think about maintaining and growing our authority and legitimacy. Then we have human resources, all of the people volunteering. We have skills and knowledge, all of the skills and knowledge that those volunteers bring to the movement. We have intangible factors, which are way more important for us than for our opposition, because the vision that we put forward is what motivates and drives people to be willing enough to say, yes, I'm going to get arrested. Yes, I'm going to go to jail. Yes, I'm willing to risk injury, risk death, to save our climate, to save our water, to protect our lands for future generations and all life on this planet. If we don't have a compelling vision, we are not going to get the sacrifices we need to put up a strong enough resistance against line 3. So intangible factors are huge for us. This also goes into hope and faith. Do people have the ability to keep going even when the chips are down, even when MPCA gives their blessing for Enbridge to start construction? So how do we bounce back from those downtimes? That is all wrapped up in these intangible factors. Then we have our material resources. How many donations are coming in? And what land resources do we have in terms of creating staging grounds up in northern Minnesota to put on a resistance struggle? Those are important. And then we have our sanctions. Now, the difference between our sanctions and Enbridge's is our sanctions are nonviolent. So we do a lot of non-cooperation, civil disobedience, interventions, but we do this nonviolently. So next slide, please. When we look at our relative sources of power right now, Enbridge has a lot more power than we do. Here's our Stop Line 3 movement. And what we need to do as a movement is shift that power. Next slide. We need to take away and undermine the power that Enbridge has, and we need to grow and mobilize and amass our power. Next slide. And if we're effective enough at this, we can actually destabilize their sources of power so much that they go into what's known as disintegration and their organization collapses. Highly unlikely we'll do that in this political struggle, but let's go on to the next slide. Now, if we were working from a conventional and guerrilla warfare strategy or weapon system, the way that we would remove their sources of power is we would kill or imprison the people, and we would bomb and destroy or take over their material resources. However, we are a nonviolent organization, so these are not our options. So what do we do to shift that power? Next slide, please. When we use principled nonviolence, it's all about defections, changing hearts and minds, winning people over to our way of viewing the struggle. Everything, all of the power that we're going to gain is from people saying, holy buckets, this struggle is important to me. I care about this struggle. I want to support it. I want to help it. And so that is how we remove their sources of power and grow our sources of power. Super huge to understand. Next slide. Defections weaken our opponents and strengthen us. The more defections we have, the better. And we need to encourage defections by making them as easy and safe as possible for people to do. And it's also important to realize that defections happen on a spectrum. Next slide, please. So we're going to look at a spectrum of defection for an Enbridge construction worker, okay? So this is somebody who's helping to build line 3, and we need to offer them different things that they can do that are a variety of risk levels for where they're at. So a low risk thing they can do is they can just treat us with respect, you know. But the next thing is maybe they could start slowing down in their work, take longer breaks, you know, work a little slower, make sure they're following all the OSHA guidelines, you know, which is going to slow them down. And then let's say they look the other way one day as they see some protesters with a bunch of lock boxes who are about to lock down. And instead of raising the flags and calling the alarm, they just look the other way and they let us get to the machines and devices and lock down and stop their day's worth of work. You know, that would be hugely helpful if we could get them to support us in this way. And then maybe as their willingness to support us grows, they might start sending us anonymous tips and leaks of information about what's going on in Enbridge, where they're going to start construction next, what day, what time. If they know dirty secrets about Enbridge, that would be problematic for Enbridge to have the public know. I mean, these are ways that our opponents can help us in significant, viable, helpful ways, and they're still pretty low risk. You know, maybe later on they don't donate to the group, maybe eventually they leave their job and they join the actively get involved in the Stop Line 3 movement, or maybe they even engage in civil disobedience. These are all ways that Enbridge construction workers could help us. Now, granted, those higher risk ways are far, far less likely. And that's okay. What we need to realize is defections happen on a spectrum. It's not all or nothing. It's not you're with us or against us. It's, hey, here's what you can do to help us out. Next slide, please. So how do we encourage defections? First, we build genuine, respectful relations with workers, with police, with community members, with everyone. We're always trying to relationship build. Whoops. So share your story and reasons for protesting to humanize yourself and explain the issue. That's part of relationship building. Share your vision that inspires you. Share your story. Let them know you're a human being. If you're a father, you know, let them know that. If you're a mother, let them know that. Do whatever to help them see how you're just as human as they are. And you're just concerned about things we're all concerned about: clean air, clean climate, etc. And then to start, when you ask for things, after you've built these relationships, ask for small things that are low risk for them. You know, that's called the foot in the door technique. And once somebody starts helping you in one way, it makes them more likely to help you further in the future and to take greater risks in the future. And we can also distribute friendly literature drops to the employees, to the police, explaining, hey, here's things you can do to help us out. You know, we know and we understand you need to work. You've got a family to take care of. We get it. Like you are not our enemy. We love, we cherish, we respect you. But but we also love, cherish, and respect all life. And here's some things you can do if you share those values. You know, and this is one of the things that we can do, these friendly lit drops. And then, of course, one of the biggest things that we always need to do is maintain nonviolent discipline. Next slide, please. Nonviolent discipline is the self-discipline required to be fearless, persistent, open, honest, and nonviolent, even in the face of violent repression. And we're going to be talking about this a lot throughout the rest of our time together. So let's just go to the next slide. But that's just a working definition to help you out. So having a clear understanding of how power works and how we use defections from their side to ours to shrink their power and grow our own, it's also important to have a comprehension of the 4 different mechanisms of change. And these also come from Gene Sharp. Conversion. This means they agree with us and voluntarily abandon the project. Now, it's not likely we're going to get Enbridge to agree, like, oh yeah, we've seen the light. That's unlikely. But this conversion is going to work a lot with helping us with workers, with the public, with politicians, with police officers. And so conversion is still in the game. Accommodation is another way that we can win. And this is where they don't agree with us, but they stop the pipeline project because the consequences to their power are too much to pay. So this is more likely how we're going to get Enbridge to fold. If we take away enough of their power that it's just too costly and it doesn't make sense for them to have this pipeline project happen, then we get accommodation. Even more likely is probably going to be nonviolent coercion. This is where, again, they don't agree with us, but they lack the power needed to move forward on the plan. You know, right now, the Department of Commerce has a lawsuit saying trying to argue that they don't have a need for this project. They haven't justified this project based on an actual need. And if they win, then they're going to stop the project. So that would be a form of nonviolent coercion. And it's most likely we're going to have to use the power of legislators or the courts to stop this pipeline. And then the fourth one is disintegration. And that's where their sources of power have completely evaporated and they essentially no longer exist. They no longer have the power or capacity to do anything. And that would be if we take away all their sources of power to the degree that they go bankrupt. And again, very unlikely that's going to happen. Next slide. So the key points to take away from these 4 mechanisms of change is that it's going to require a mixture of these mechanisms of change, and they're all going to be at play. Conversion is going to be huge in terms of getting more public support and encouraging police and Enbridge employees and maybe even some politicians to be on our side. Accommodation or nonviolent coercion is more likely for how we're going to get politicians and Enbridge to abandon the pipeline. And that's going to, for the politicians, of course, require that we convert a lot of the public to be opposed to this pipeline. Next slide. So if we go back to our strategic levels of decision making and we look at our operational plan, for our mechanisms of victory, we just plug in accommodation, nonviolent coercion, and conversion. And we keep those in mind. These are the ways that we are going to win this struggle. Next slide. What is direct action? So we're just going to define some terms to help us out. And we use the Ruckus Society's definition, which is the strategic use of immediately effective acts to achieve a social or political end and challenge an unjust power dynamic. So immediately effective acts. Examples of this include, next slide, please. Divesting from banks that fund pipelines. So here we see a divestment protest. And again, that's taking away the power. Montgomery bus boycotts in 1955, 1956. There was a year-long bus boycott because they wanted people to, they wanted the buses to be integrated, and that made power. Next slide. And it looks like we're having some technical difficulties with the slides here, but here we go. Workers strike at Northern Pipeline Co-op. This removes that power of human resources. When the workers go on strike, those powers are gone. So these are examples of legal forms of opposition, legal forms of direct action. Of course, there's also more risky forms of direct action. Next slide, which we call civil disobedience. So let's define what we mean when we say civil disobedience. Next slide. Civil disobedience is violating an unjust law or a just law unjustly applied while being open and honest, loving, and willing to accept the consequences. This is Martin Luther King Jr.'s definition, and the disobedient part is the willingness to break the law. The civil part is being open and honest, loving, and willing to accept the consequences. Some examples of civil disobedience include, next slide, soft blockades like this one in front of a Wells Fargo, where everybody sits in, locks their arms, and prevents people from going to the bank. Another soft blockade would include these people who are standing in front of construction machines and preventing them from doing their work. We also have hard lockdowns or a hard blockade. This woman has her hands in some barrels. Usually those barrels are filled with concrete and there's rebar in there, and they chain their hand to the rebar so that they can't be pulled apart. And then it's very difficult for these contraptions to be undone. And so very few people can actually create a very huge blockade, a very problematic blockade for law enforcement and the company to deal with. Next slide. Here we have a lockdown. This man is in a lockbox. Again, it's a pipe, and then it has a lot of stuff around it that makes it hard to saw and drill through. There's a rebar in there that he's locked into. And so this is a way to shut down the operation of machinery for the day. Next slide. You also have banner hangs. This was a banner hang at US Bank Stadium to encourage divestment from all those people who are funding the DAPL, or the Dakota Access Pipeline. Next slide. And we have valve turners, and these are people who actually break into the pumping stations and shut off the valves of the pipelines. And you can see here they're having to cut open a lock, so they're doing some property damage. And then they also, because this is very risky, if you just shut down one terminal but you haven't stopped the whole line, that can cause a rupture and a huge oil spill and leak. So they called Enbridge 15 or 20 minutes beforehand. They said, hey, this is our plan. We're going in, we're going to shut down this valve. You need to shut down the whole system. Otherwise, there's going to be a major incident. And then they went and did this. So it's very risky action, but of course, Enbridge, the amount of money they would lose in a pipeline disaster is going to encourage them to do this. But they did this openly, willingly, and or openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the consequences. And I believe they're all facing felony charges. Next slide. So that's an introduction to direct action and civil disobedience and what we mean by those. Next, we're going to talk about nonviolence. Next slide. So there's two, and I encourage you to join me. Barbara Deming is, she was an active civil rights, peace activist, also worked for queer rights as a lesbian, also, you know, was a nonviolent strategist. And she would talk about the two hands of nonviolence. And I invite you to put the one hand out like this. This is the first hand of nonviolence. This is a hand that says, you are a part of the human family. And I care about you, I respect you. I am never going to sever this tie. You're never going to be excluded from humanity, okay? This is the love that we show others. And then the second hand of nonviolence is like this, and it says, and yet at the same time, you are causing a lot of harm, and we cannot let this harm continue. And we are going to take action to stop you in all nonviolent ways possible, while remaining loving and compassionate and kind to you. So these are the two hands of nonviolence, and this is how we understand and define nonviolence. It's that always being open and loving to people, and also saying no to all the harm that they're causing. Next slide, please. Gandhi put it this way: nonviolence means avoiding injury to anything on earth in thought, word, and deed, which is the first open, loving hand. And then second, next slide. And it also means non-cooperation with evil is as much a duty as it is to cooperate with the good. And that's the hand like this. So nonviolence is active resistance. And this hand uses protective force. This is the minimum force necessary to stop the harm being done while not diminishing the person doing the harmful activity. Next slide. So protective force improves efforts to de-escalate a situation. It's kind, it's inclusive, it's welcoming, and it increases defections. Next slide. Punitive force is different. This is using power to threaten, intimidate, humiliate, shame, harass, annoy, and otherwise punish an enemy. And physically nonviolent tactics may be used in punitive force. An example of this, next slide, and I'm going to give a content warning. The next slide shows the Ku Klux Klan dressed in robes and hoods at a cross burning. Next slide. So an example of punitive force is a cross burning that's also non-violent or not, physically injuring anyone. They're burning a cross, they're all dressed up, they're hiding their faces. It's a clear show of threat and intimidation. And they do this to terrorize people in the community. So this is a form of punitive force, but we also see punitive force at work in our movements for social justice. Next slide. We see hostility and judgment used as punitive force. Here we see a sign, burn this MFer down. Hunt scum, kill for fun. No justice, no peace. F racist police. So we're using hostility and judgment to try to punish others. And this is actually mixing our weapon systems. This is completely in the system of conventional warfare and guerrilla warfare, where you have to dehumanize the enemy so that you can twist your mind up to such a degree that you're willing to kill and injure them. Because in general, we as human beings, we don't want to kill and hurt each other. And when we do, if we're involved in violent act, or we even witness a violent act, we can get post-traumatic stress disorder from that. So this is not the path we want to go down. This path of judgment and hostility is in direct contradiction to the beloved community we're trying to create, as well as the helping us make our movement welcoming and inviting so people feel comfortable joining. Next slide. Ridicule and hate is also used as a punitive force. This balloon of Trump as a baby is used to ridicule him for his shortcomings. And this sign, I hate crowds, but I hate Trump more. Again, it's showing hate. It's not in alignment with the weapon system of nonviolence. It's using punitive force. Next slide. So punitive force creates fear and anger, which escalates and polarizes a situation. And it's not just against the people who we're targeting. You might say, well, who cares if Trump feels fear and anger at that? We operate in a community, and there are a lot of eyes on us. And people are seeing what we're doing, and they're evaluating our character based on how we behave. So it also creates fear and anger in those people who are Trump supporters, and even some of us who may not support Trump, but who recognize his humanity and don't wish him ill because he is one of our family members as part of the human race. We might see this and say, oh, I'm really uncomfortable. I don't want to be at a protest where that's the message. So it escalates and polarizes a situation. It decreases defections, and it undermines the effective use of the weapon system of nonviolence. So we set punitive force to the side. Next slide. So what I've come up with is two types of nonviolence that are often being practiced in our movement. One is physical nonviolence, and that I would say is the most often used form of nonviolence. It's basically saying, I'm not going to physically cause you harm. However, we're going to use punitive force to use physically nonviolent tactics to threaten, intimidate, humiliate, shame, harass, and otherwise punish you. And this asks far less of the participants, but it actually prevents nonviolence from working to its full potential. And I need to say, I have no judgment towards people who use physical nonviolence. Good on them for being active, good on them for giving of their time and energy to make a better world. And I personally used physical nonviolence for probably 10 years of my activism. But I want to make a distinction between physical nonviolence and principled nonviolence or Kingian nonviolence. In principled nonviolence, we say, There's no physical, mental, emotional, or psychological violence. We only use protective force. And we ask more of our participants, but this has dramatically more results in terms of changing hearts and minds and increasing defections. So next slide. If we go back to our strategic levels of decision making and we look at our weapon system, we're going to update that to say principled nonviolence. And we're also going to include MLK's 6 principles, which we're going to be discussing, because those 6 principles are all at a policy level, which means we have to obey them at the strategy, tactics, logistics, and lower levels if we really want our movement to be powerful, effective at getting the masses to join us, at growing our power, and at also undermining the power of our opponents. Next slide. And I also want to be really clear here. I'm not here to dictate strategy. I'm not here to say that every group out there should be nonviolent. You know, this is about, well, and I really offer my love, respect, and best wishes to all people who are struggling for justice. What this training is about is how to show how the weapon system of principled nonviolence works to best effect. Okay, I'm doing this to help us increase our effectiveness and also to increase understanding between people who practice principled nonviolence and those who practice physical nonviolence, so that we can get along, because we're gonna have these camps, and we still need to be a movement that functions and works together and seeks a common aim. So those are my goals behind all of this. And we're going to move on now to MLK's 6 principles of nonviolence. Next slide. And if I could have, is anybody, it doesn't look like anybody's willing to read except me. So I guess I will read this slide. Nonviolence is a way of life that requires courage. So that's the principle. And now I'm going to explain it. Nonviolent action is love in action. It is not apathy, passivity, or bowing down to threats of violence. Nonviolence moves to protect, heal, and reconcile. In opposing injustice, nonviolent activists will face repression and nonviolence. Some of us may get injured, others may die. Nonviolence requires the courage and willingness to sacrifice in order to stand up to repression and face violence without retaliating. So this is a big ask. Let's go to the next slide. And part of it, it says, is nonviolence is a way of life. And the reason this is such is because you wouldn't go and do a 2-hour basketball practice and then think you've mastered basketball. And the same is true with nonviolence. You don't go to a 2-hour training and think, oh, now I've mastered the principles of nonviolence. Absolutely not. The way to master it is to practice it, and to practice it in every single area of your life. So in your relationship with your parents, with your other family members, with your colleagues at work, with the activists that you work with the opponents and the people that irritate you, you have to do nonviolence in every area of life, because otherwise you're not going to have the skills and the tools ready at your disposal when the poop hits the fan. Because when we're doing civil disobedience, direct action, we're going to have much more difficult and challenging experiences. And for us to have our nonviolence muscles work and in good working order, we need to be practicing them all the time. Next slide. So one example of this is of a high pressure situation is a school shooting that was happening in Georgia, and Antoinette Tuff actually stopped it. The school shooter ran into her classroom. It was kind of later in the day, and I don't believe she was in a classroom by herself. And the school shooter ran in there, and he pulled the gun on her, and she said, "Can I go to the bathroom?" And this is what is known as flipping the script. It's not acting out the role you're supposed to. If she would have jumped under the desk or ran away, or, then he would have shot her, because that's exactly what he expects. But when you flip the script, he's like, whoa, go to the bath. And he's like, Sure. And so she left the room, and as she's leaving, she's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that worked. She realized this kid is going to go and shoot a bunch of people unless I do something about it. And so she actually just went back to the room and she had a conversation with him, and she talked him down. She de-escalated him, and she got him to, she called 911. She said, I have the school shooter with me. He's coming out. Please, he's dropping his gun. And she talked him down. And that epitomizes the creativity and the willingness to sacrifice of a nonviolent warrior. And that's what we're calling on people to do. Next slide. So nonviolence does not mean doing nothing. There's some people who are like, oh, I'm sitting here watching this atrocity happen, but I'm not causing any harm, and that's nonviolence. And we're saying no. Nonviolence means love in action. What would love do in that situation? How would love respond in that situation? And sometimes that means we need to make very significant sacrifices. And that's the other part of this first principle, is it requires courage. Next slide. And we all need to ask ourselves, who or what are we willing to die for? Who or what are we willing to suffer for? And these are 3 students who, when a school shooter entered their classroom and pulled a gun, he entered the classroom late, he pulled a gun, these 3 immediately jumped up and rushed him and pushed him against the wall and tried to disarm him. In the process, Joshua Jones was shot twice, but he lived. Kendricks Castillo was shot and killed, and Brendan Bailey managed to survive the incident unscathed. But that was what love in action looked like in that moment. It was them rushing to defend their classmates. And it didn't take them a second to make that call. They just did it. And that's the type of courage and the type of sacrifice that we need to be ready to make. And so it's important that we think about, like, what are we willing to sacrifice? Next slide. Are we willing to risk arrest? Are we willing to do a tree sit so they can't cut down the trees where they need to put the pipeline through? Are we willing to lock down to a machine, risk arrest, risk getting pepper sprayed, risk going to jail? These are questions that each of us as individuals need to think about and consider. Like, how important is this cause for us? Next slide. And as nonviolent practitioners, we also need to ask ourselves, are we willing to let go of our judgment, anger, and hatred? This, for many of us, seems like a sacrifice. We depend on our judgment and anger and hatred to fuel our fire and to motivate us. And we're going to talk about other strategies for that later. But can we set it aside? Can we start to have a compassionate relationship with those people who are doing harm and participating in the harm, so that we can create beloved community? Next slide. And that brings us to the second point, which is the ultimate goals of nonviolent campaigns are reconciliation and the creation of beloved community. In the beloved community, all people, animals, and life forms are treated with dignity, respect, and compassion. Disagreements are debated, resolved, or left unresolved without any hatred or violence between the parties. In beloved community, we create solutions that help everyone on all sides of the conflict get their needs met. In beloved community, we seek reconciliation and friendship with our opponents. To make beloved community real, we behave as though it already exists. We treat all life with dignity, we engage conflict without hatred or bitterness, and we seek reconciliation with those who cause social and environmental injustice. Next slide, please. So I want us to pause here. In our movement, we know our goal is to stop line 3. And that's a goal that's framed in a negative. And that's not motivating for a lot of people. So we need to think, what's the positive? What are we trying to create? What's the beloved community that we envision if we imagine all of our campaigns and all of the various issues that we care about to be successful. And so I want you to just take a minute, and we're going to reflect on that. So kind of consider this a form of meditation. You can close your eyes if that helps you go inside and think. But I want you to just visualize what the beloved community looks like to you. Like if all of your wildest fantasies of a clean earth, a healthy water, you know, so water so clean we can drink out of the streams, air so pure and fresh we can breathe it in deeply knowing there's no pollution in it whatsoever, a climate that is healing and that is healthy and that sustains life, a world where structural racism no longer exists, a world where there's no fossil fuels, a world where everybody has meaningful work that serves their community and serves the environment. You know, just think of all the different beautiful ways that this beloved community might look. There's no poverty, no homelessness, no war. All of the money that the trillions of dollars we've poured into nuclear weapons over the years are now being invested in serving people, helping them get their needs met. You know, whatever. And then I want you to focus on, what does it look like interpersonally? Let's say there's somebody who you really disagree with in this beloved community. What does that relationship look like? How can you disagree with someone and still respect and understand them? How can that conflict actually be used to increase intimacy and understanding between the two of you? And an appreciation of your differences. And why can't we start to relate to each other this way right now? So come back from that activity, and if you could, in the chat, just say how that activity worked for you. How did it, what thoughts or feelings came up, and what were some of the things that you most loved about the beloved community that you envisioned? And I know for some of us, it's really hard to do this activity. We hardly ever think about the true vision that we want. So it can be difficult if this is a new activity for you, but I encourage people to do this all the time. Constantly think about that vision of what you want in the world, what you want your world to look like, because it will help you to lean into it. It'll help you define it and describe it to others who you're trying to sway and bring into our cause. And we have a comment, somebody loved it. They felt a lot of relief doing it. I get a sense of peace. I get a sense of expansion, a sense of possibility and hope when I do it. Now, again, if you haven't practiced this, might be your first thing. Your first thing might be like, this is really frustrating. I don't really know what it is I'm seeking for. And that's why we need to do this activity. Yep, and here's someone saying it was emotional, hard to conceptualize things, yet to be realized, but that there was unity felt in the practice. And yeah, in science, some people call this science fictioning. We're dreaming the world we want into existence. We have to create the world in our mind first, and then it helps it unfold in our reality more clearly. So please do this. And next slide, please. So when we look at our strategic levels of decision making, we don't want it to be just stop line 3 because that's negative. We really want to make it creating beloved community and stopping line 3. So we're going to put that in our policy level. And then let's talk about what are the ramifications of this. Next slide. So on the strategy, tactics, and logistics level, we need to create a very powerful vision. We need to share what we want, not what we don't want. We need a vision that inspires ourselves and others. We need a vision that we are willing to sacrifice for. And a powerful vision increases the power in our intangible factors pillar, because that's going to make people more willing to want to make sacrifices. It's going to make them more committed to the cause. So here's just an example of a vision, and we can you know just see how it lands for you. But I envision where Black, white, or brown, native or newcomer, we Minnesotans support safe, clean, healthy water and lands. And I firmly believe that all Minnesotans want Indigenous treaty rights honored. We all want and seek a healthy climate for ourselves and future generations. And that is going to require an elegant, just, and rapid transition away from fossil fuel use. We support investing in wind and solar energy infrastructure and the creation of good paying union jobs, especially for rural Minnesotans. New jobs, good jobs in clean industries are something we can all agree on. We can create a Minnesota where we protect our air, water, and climate, share in our economic prosperity, and build bridges rather than divide each other up. So here is just one example of a vision that is very inclusive, that speaks to the needs of all of the different people throughout Minnesota, so that and affirms their values in this situation. You know, some people are concerned about the environment, some people are concerned about jobs, some people are concerned about equity. How can we say, yeah, we are all concerned about that? How can we work together to get all of our needs met? And that is the vision of beloved community, and that is what we can use going forward to help win more defections to our cause. Next slide. So one of my heroes is Audre Lorde. She's a Black, vegan, lesbian womanist. And she says, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And I'm very honored that in our Stop Line 3 movement, next slide, we have developed inclusive and anti-oppression policies. And so the Indigenous leaders of our movement have asked for some boundaries to be placed to help respect them. They ask that like when you are involved with Line 3 activism, they ask that you have no racist sports or logo or gear, that you do not appropriate Indigenous cultures. So they don't want to see you with dream catchers, with Indigenous drums, with other implements of Indigenous rituals, you know, a headband, things like that. They don't want you to do the war whoop. There might be Indians who are doing a war whoop, and that is part of their culture. We have to remember, they've had 500 years of exploitation in our country. They have very little control over their own cultural artifacts. And so this is something they're asking of us, and it's important that we do our best to respect them and to honor them and to let them know we care about them. Also, they ask that no white people wear dreadlocks and that people don't bring magic or witch practices to Indigenous camps. Now, myself as a longtime meditator, I asked if meditation is okay, and that's fine. So for those of you who are concerned about that, next slide. And then for other ways to be inclusive and anti-oppressive, they ask that there be no prejudice towards women, people of color, LGBTQ people, the elderly, and other marginalized communities. No misgendering of others, you know, so if somebody uses they as a pronoun, do your best to use the correct pronoun. No microaggressions, and also recognizing the difference between intentions and impacts and making amends for harmful impacts. So you may have intended one thing, but it landed in a way that really upset someone else. Just apologize. Next slide. And I know I went over these really quickly, so you can learn more about this inclusive anti-oppressive framework in our Mindful Direct Action Training Handouts PDF, which is found at boundlessloveproject.org and our nonviolent resources page. And I'll send you a link to that so you can download that PDF and read up on it. Next slide. But those are some specifics on how we implement beloved community in our movement. And so a lot of times we talk about our movement work as planting seeds. So we can think of planting seeds as stopping line 3 work. But if we plant it in soil that is dead and dying, it lacks nutrients, it lacks biota, it lacks life to be healthy, then those seeds are going to die. And we can think of amending the soil as the beloved community work that we're doing, because that makes the soil rich and prosperous. And we can do both of these things at the same time. We can plant the seeds and amend the soil. And this does require us letting go of our own greed, judgment, and falsehoods. But this is how, the great thing is like, even if we're not successful in our struggle this time around, by amending the soil, we're making it so that the environment is easier for us to get wins down the line. Of course, my hopes is that we are tremendously successful this time around and in the future. So next slide. So this third point is, this third principle is, we oppose the forces of harm, not the people who cause harm. The forces of harm that we oppose are the infinite ways that greed, judgment, and falsehood arise. Rather than defining people who do harm as bad or evil, we recognize them as suffering. They are trapped by the forces of greed, hatred, and falsehood. Trapped by these forces, they suffer fear, hatred, and confusion. Acknowledging their suffering, we offer them compassion and seek to save them from these forces. Even when people do great harm, we still recognize their inherent worth, value, and potential for goodness, and offer them our goodwill and love. They are not our enemies, rather they are our family members who have strayed from our nonviolent community. So this is a whole different shift in worldview. You know, all of us are conditioned to think bad person should be punished. And we're saying bad person is a suffering person. Bad person is someone who deserves our compassion and who needs help. And we are willing to help them. We are willing to give them healing love, healing compassion, to help them see a new way and come out of their misery. Next slide. And what does this mean at the strategy, tactics, and logistics level? Next. It means that we're not going to be hostile or use punitive force. No insults or name calling. No aggression, no attempts to humiliate, shame, punish, or annoy our opponents. No property destruction or vandalism unless they're done as a form of civil disobedience, where we do it openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the consequences, as the valve turners did. And of course, their property destruction was limited to all that was necessary for them to do their civil disobedience. It wasn't gratuitous. So no hostility or punitive force. We're going to be friendly and respectful. And look at this picture. Like, I don't know about you, but when I look at this picture, I almost get teary-eyed because it's so powerful to me. It shows just that sort of respect and love that embodies the beloved community. Next slide. So to encourage defections, people need to feel safe and like they will be welcomed and appreciated by our movement. If they see a movement that's heavily judgmental, heavily hostile, they're not going to see that. And as an activist, I remember I was a very big fan of By Any Means Necessary. And it was a huge light bulb moment for me when I realized, but what if the means necessary are me actually respecting and honoring those people who are causing harm? And do I really mean by any means necessary? And it was like, wow, those are the means necessary. I need to befriend the people who are causing harm. I need to create healthy relationships with these people. It was, and that's what this weapon system is telling us are the means necessary to achieve the goal. Next slide. Now, breaking the law is inherently polarizing. Next slide. And we don't want polarization, and that's why we do civil disobedience. When we break the law, we also do it openly and honestly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the consequences. Next slide. So when we look at secrecy and deception, these are the tools of the weapon systems of conventional and guerrilla warfare. And it increases paranoia, fear, and mistrust among activists. I remember working with activists who were so afraid of, I don't even know what, but they were paranoid, and they felt like they couldn't go to a protest because they were going to be, some person was going to monitor them or whatever. And when you have secrets that you need to keep, people start to feel a lot of mistrust and fear. And it actually can do a lot of damage to a movement. It also increases fear and mistrust in our opponents because they don't know what's coming at them, and so they're on high alert. And when they have fear and mistrust, they're less able to hear our message. They're less able to be willing to talk to us and negotiate. And also, when our secrets are discovered, it polarizes and escalates the situation and undermines our authority as credible people of good character. So this decreases defections, and ultimately it undermines the effective use of the nonviolent weapons system. So in general, we need to be open and honest. Next slide. And this is very empowering. It is super empowering to say, hey, Enbridge, we're knowing you're starting construction, and as long as you construct, we are going to be mounting operations to delay and stop the construction. We are going to be putting our bodies and our lives on the line to stop you in your tracks. It's super empowering to just say what you mean. Hey, I love the climate. I love humanity. I love wildlife. And I'm going to do what it takes to stop this pipeline because I see it as an existential threat to our future. It's 50 coal-fired power plants. Super empowering to just say what you mean. So that's great. It also opens up the lines of communication. When you tell them, like, here's our plans, they can respond. It also de-escalates the situation. It makes them feel like, not right away, but as that trust is built up, they start to believe you and they start to trust you, and they might be more willing to enter into negotiations. It's also kind, inclusive, and welcoming. It increases defections because, again, it's not just Enbridge who we're talking to, but as we have this conversation with them, the whole world is watching and they're seeing how we're doing this. And when they see how open and honest we are, they develop respect towards us, even if it's a grudging respect because they want to hate us. They start to respect us because of our character. And it maintains our integrity and authority, which strengthens that authority pillar of power. Next slide. And then accepting the penalty of our civil disobedience is also important. And I love this quote by King. An individual who breaks the law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law. And so by accepting the penalty, by being open and loving, it really helps maintain our integrity and authority. It helps minimize polarization and fear in us and in others. And it also sets boundaries for us that prevent excessive lawlessness on our part. So you can damage property if you do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the consequences. You can violate the law as long as you're willing to follow these plans. And it makes us pause, because if we can be lawless with no consequences, we might be more lawless than if we know we're having to actually bear the brunt of the consequences. So it's a good boundary that we set on ourselves. And nonviolent discipline is really what this is all about when we're talking about being open, honest, and willing to accept the consequences. So I'm bringing this definition back to remind us that nonviolent discipline is the self-discipline required to be fearless, persistent, open, honest, and nonviolent, even in the face of violent repression. And this turns out to be hugely important as we look at the fourth principle, which we are going to do after a break. So take 5 minutes, shut off your screen, mute yourselves, get off the screen, and just go do whatever you need to do, bathroom break, walk around, dance, whatever, and then come back ready for the thing. And I'm going to ring the bell I'm going to ring this bell when it's time to get started again. If you only remember one thing from this training, I want you to leave here with a sense of what political jiu-jitsu is and how it works to undermine our opponent's sources of power and grow our own. Because typically the way movements win is by a series of political jiu-jitsus that escalate and dramatically change the power dynamics. So let's look about this fourth principle and try to understand this. We willingly accept suffering without retaliation to trigger political jiu-jitsu and benefit our cause. As we effectively work for justice, our friends who oppose us will respond by punishing us with repression. When we publicly face this repression without retaliating in violence, we trigger political jiu-jitsu, also known as backfire, or the paradox of repression. Political jiu-jitsu is when the public witnesses unearned repression and withdraws their support and cooperation from those who repress, while giving their support and cooperation to those being repressed. The greater the contrast between our opponent's selfish violence and our selfless, courageous nonviolence, the more we transform hearts and minds, and the greater the shifts in power that result. Therefore, we do our best to maintain a courageous and loving attitude at all times, especially in the face of violent repression. All right, so that's a lot of information, and we're going to kind of go through it a little more slowly next. So content warning. The next 3 slides show, in this order, first, a white mob attempting to humiliate and degrade civil rights activists. Secondly, youth protesting for civil rights being hit with a high-powered water hose. And in the third photo, there will be police beating civil rights activists with batons. And what I want you to do is, if you're up for it, and if it's safe, it feels safe enough for you to do so, I want you to just look at these pictures and just notice what you're feeling. So this is a 1963 lunch counter sit-in for integration. And we see a white mob pouring things on the heads of nonviolent protesters who are staging a sit-in. And just gently notice how this picture makes you feel. Next slide. Here's youth protesting for civil rights being blasted by high-pressured water hoses. Again, notice how this makes you feel. Next slide. Here we have civil rights marchers encountering police on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. We see a club in the hand of one of the officers, his other hand on the man. Next slide. We're gonna have 2 more slides. The first one is going to show police pepper spraying seated protesters at a Occupy demonstration, and the second one, police aiming a semi-automatic at men who are engaged in spiritual practice. Next slide. So this is an officer pepper spraying Occupy Oakland activists. Next slide. And here we have men engaged in spiritual practice getting arrested during the raid at the Ossetti-Sakowin camp at Standing Rock. One is doing a smudging ceremony and the other is in a prayerful meditation. And just notice how this makes you feel. Next slide. So I don't know about you, but when I see those things, I feel some outrage. I feel that there's an injustice happening. I feel sad. I feel angry. I feel I have a lot of feelings. And I hope that some of you also shared in that, a sense of, and some of you may even been, some of us are inspired looking at this, like seeing these civil rights activists accepting such abuse to make a point about their cause. Some of us may feel a sense of urgency, like I need to do something about this. I need to get involved. And this is the human psychological and emotional principles that political jiu-jitsu is based on. Because what happens is when repression is witnessed and the witness tends to withdraw cooperation from the repressors and give their support to those who are being repressed. However, this only works if the people being repressed are maintaining nonviolent discipline. If they are using violence, well, then everybody's working on an even playing field. Next slide. And so I'll get back to that even playing field a little bit later. But there's two vital aspects of political jiu-jitsu that are important to increase its power and magnify it. The first is contrast. The greater the contrast of violence by the repressor and non-violence by the repressed, the greater the change of hearts and minds it causes in those who witness it. So we really want to create a great contrast. We want to be the man offering flowers to the police while they're pepper spraying us. Next slide. So maintaining nonviolent discipline helps to increase that contrast. If we're hostile, if we are throwing bricks, if we're throwing water bottles, it evens the playing field, and that legitimizes their violence against us in the eyes of others. So if they're like, oh, well, they were fighting with fire, fight fire with fire. Okay, let them be repressed. Let them get arrested. Send them to jail. They're ruffians. And the problem with this is we don't want an even playing field, because on an even playing field, they are always going to be able to outpower us in terms of violence and repression. They have huge systems of jail cells and police and all the riot gear and tear gas at their disposal, and they will use them. They know all the pain techniques and pain holds, and they will use them on us. So the question is, if it's going to happen anyway, do we want this to benefit our cause, or do we want it to just happen and not benefit our cause? And that's why we must maintain nonviolent discipline, because then it makes their repression look monstrous, and we gain from political jiu-jitsu. And political jiu-jitsu, because it's one of our best weapons, and if we utilize it effectively, it actually undermines their credibility and power while growing our own. And it also makes it where they can't use repression as easily. It makes it harder for them to repress us because they feel the backlash. And so they get more nuanced, let's say. They might seem more friendly when they arrest us, things like that. And so it's a challenge. But if they back off on the repression, then we can go gangbusters on being more and more aggressive in our efforts to shut things down, because we know that the repression is going to be less. So there's just so many powerful benefits from political jiu-jitsu, and that's why we need to keep that contrast as different as possible. Next slide. The second vital aspect of political jiu-jitsu is amplification. The more people who witness the repression in video, pictures, and stories, the better it is for our cause. Next slide. So we have to be thinking in terms of how can we amplify, next slide, please. How can we amplify repression? And this means we always want to alert the media and alternative media to our actions where repression is likely to happen, which we know at any civil disobedience, it's likely to happen. We also want to have our own videographers documenting the situation of what's going on and then putting it on social media, giving it to media outlets, letting it be seen. And then we want to keep that story of repression and injustice alive in our movement communications, in the speeches we give, in the articles we write. We want to keep referencing back to them. And next slide. And the Black Lives Matter movement has done such an excellent job with the Say Their Name campaign, because that is them reminding everybody of all of the types of repression they have faced just for being Black, and how completely unbalanced it is compared to what a white person can expect in a similar situation in terms of the mistreatment and being killed and whatnot. So that's a great way that they're using to amplify it, and we can learn a lot from that. Next slide. So here's a content warning. During the next slide, we're going to be discussing the details of the death of George Floyd, because this is one of the largest acts of political jiu-jitsu we've seen in our time, or largest incidences of political jiu-jitsu. And so we'll go on to the next slide. So when we think of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, first we see huge contrast. Floyd was unarmed, he was subdued and laying on the street, he was pleading for breath, he was calling out for his mother. The police were cold, calm, and matter of fact, while upstanders were pleading for them to stop killing him. You know, so we had huge contrast between somebody who had no power, was not resisting, just wanted to breathe, and these cops that for 8.5 minutes just sat on him as he was pleading for his life. And then we look at the amplification. Thank goodness there was a 17-year-old, Darnella Frazier, who videotaped the entire excruciating incident. And news stations broadcast it everywhere. I don't know anybody who hasn't seen at least some of the video of what happened in the United States. And this triggered the hugest political jiu-jitsu ever. There was an organization here in Minnesota called the Black Visions Collective. They started in 2017, small grassroots group, and they raised something like $30 million in a few weeks. So they're, you know, from like a few $1,000s of operating generally to millions and millions of dollars. We have seen the conversation on structural racism be brought into the mainstream and been discussed for months and months since this incident happened. And this has been a huge shift for many of us white people, myself included. Seeing George Floyd and what happened has made me realize, like, I am not doing enough. It's maybe impossible for me to do enough about this issue, and I need to be more active. I need to be more vocal. I need to be a better ally to my Black, Brown, Indigenous brothers and sisters and siblings. And I think a lot of us have felt that way after seeing this. So this is an example. And again, usually a movement is going to see several of these types of political jujitsus to create the shifts in power that they need to see huge victories. Next slide. And it's also important to think of political jiu-jitsu as being on a spectrum. And on one end of the spectrum is where we don't require a lot of nonviolent discipline to get the results. And on the other side, we need impeccable nonviolent discipline. And this largely, so that the greater our nonviolent discipline, the more of these positive benefits that we're going to see. So if we have little nonviolent discipline, but there's repression, this might help some of the activists to set aside their ego and be more cooperative. It might help activists find more unity and cohesion. It might help activists be willing to take more risks and to suffer more because they see one of their own comrades suffering. But then you need to be more nonviolent to get sympathetic bystanders active, you know, and to get disinterested people to start to pay attention to the issue, and then to get disinterested people to become sympathetic, and then to get disinterested people to start getting active. So you need to be far more nonviolent in that, to get those changes, and even more nonviolent if you want the opponent to start respecting you. So if we want the construction workers, the police, the people at Enbridge, the politicians to respect us, and if we want our opponents to become sympathetic, we need to be even more people of character, and our opponents to take action on our behalf, and then our opponents to fully defect and just come over to our side and embrace us wholeheartedly and be active in us. All of that requires impeccable nonviolent discipline. And so that's really what's asked of all of us, because we don't have the power right now to stop the pipeline. But if we gain power, if we take away their power, we can do this. So we need to have that impeccable nonviolent discipline. Next slide. So in the content warning, the next slide is going to show a dog attacking an indigenous Dakota Axine pipeline protester. So early days of Standing Rock, they had a security company that brought dogs to the protests and just let them go on the activists. And we see it here. And this was very helpful at rallying people who were already sympathetic to the cause to get more active and to go to Standing Rock and to participate in Standing Rock. Now, these dearly beloved family members of mine, you know, I'm looking at them and I'm seeing like one has a stick and I'm wondering, well, is he using that stick to like hit the dog or attack the dog? I'm also seeing they have masks on their face, and this was pre-COVID. You know, now with COVID, it's okay to wear masks at protests, but back then people might be like, oh, what are they hiding? Like, what are they up to something nefarious that they need to conceal themselves? Like, what's going on? So this political jiu-jitsu, because there's less nonviolent discipline, there's more likelihood it's just going to affect people who are already sympathetic. And again, that doesn't mean no judgment on them. Love them to death. So thankful for their service and so happy that they stood up and did what they did. And it really did help the Dakota Access Pipeline project, but there's ways it could be tweaked to be more effective. Next slide. And this is what brings us to the fifth principle of nonviolence. And it reads, we purify our minds of hatred, greed, and falsehood while embracing unconditional love for all life. None of us are immune to the forces of harm, judgment, greed, and falsehood. Therefore, we engage in regular practices to help us purify our minds of these forces so we can relate lovingly to all people, animals, life forms, and situations, regardless of the harm they may cause. This is about doing the inner work. Next slide. Another great quote by Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Well, what are those tools? It's judgment, it's hatred, it's anger, it's violence. And so we need to purify our minds and hearts of these things so that we can be effective advocates. Next slide. Oh, actually back it up. Another quote that I love is from Bell Hooks. She talks in her book, Feminism is for Everyone, about the enemy within, how just because you're a woman doesn't mean you're a feminist. And if you haven't done the internal work of dealing with the internal patriarch, you could actually be reinforcing the patriarchy in your efforts to create change. And as a gay person who suffered a lot of internalized homophobia, I completely understand what she's talking about. You know, it took me years because as human beings, our brains are like sponges. They just absorb everything from our culture. And unless we've done the work to sort through it all and see like, hey, what makes sense and what doesn't, the brain just runs all these programs that it's absorbed. And so I had in my mind a sense of, you know, well, a derogatory understanding of gay people. And when I found out I was gay, I had a lot of self-hatred and self-loathing, and I needed to do a lot of inner work to see the falsehoods and all of that and let it go. And I've had to do the same with my racial biases, with my male biases, with you know, all of the social justice issues. So how can we do this work? Well, first of all, it's important, next slide. It's important that we learn to see with eyes of love. And this is that unconditional love that this principle is talking about. So if we compare judgment, anger, and hatred and sort of see how that views the world with how compassion and love sees the world, we see very clear patterns, and we start practicing to see the world through eyes of love. So the way these two things are the same is that both of them provide us energy to take courageous action. So that's the same in both parts. But judgment sees perpetrators as responsible for their actions. It says, oh, you did this willingly, you're bad. Whereas compassion sees perpetrators as victims of their environment and victims of the forces of harm. So just like I didn't consciously absorb all of these negative stereotypes that I was acting out, people who are doing bad things probably didn't have any choice in the matter. They absorbed it from their environment and they're operating on the programs that they were taught. You know, maybe they had abuse in their situation and so all they know is abuse and violence. Maybe, you know, we don't know what ways they've suffered to make them the way they are, but we see them as victims of that, of their environment. Now, in judgment, we judge them to be bad, unworthy, and deserving of punishment. But in compassion, we see them as suffering. Like we realize they're lost and deluded, and it's causing them a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, a lot of confusion. And so we want to help them. Judgment demonizes and villainizes the people, whereas compassion recognizes their humanity, recognizes that they're family, that they matter, that they too want to be safe and protected, peaceful and happy, healthy and strong. And so, whereas judgment seeks to punish, harm, disgrace, or humiliate them, compassion seeks their well-being and the well-being of all life at the same time. So how can we help them and help all life? How can we help heal them, help bring them out of their suffering? Judgment creates a hierarchy of life forms. Some are deserving and some are bad, you know, and there's many levels in between of who's more deserving and who's less. Compassion says we are all one. We are an interdependent fabric of one being and one life, and there's complete egalitarianism between all life forms. And if one suffers, we all suffer. So that's just how love sees the world. Whereas judgment, if you practice judgment, if you practice hatred, if you practice anger, it will cause you to burn out. It's going to cause you ill health. You're going to direct that judgment at yourself when you fall short, and you're going to have a lot of shame. And I was very judgmental, and I remember the day where I just felt it as like a poisonous toxin in my body and how much it was corroding my insides. And it just woke me up, and it's like, you know what? Maybe someday this is going to be necessary, but I have to set this aside right now. This is really not helping me function very well in life. Because when we feel judgment, it causes us to behave unskillfully. Like we're amped up, our body is in fight or flight mode, and we think we need to like save ourselves. And it's hard to make skillful, mindful decisions when all that is going on. Whereas compassion, it leads us to greater self-control, more effective actions, and more defections to our side. It also allows us to be skillful in ways that serve all life simultaneously. And so those of us who embrace principled nonviolence, we start training ourselves to see with the eyes of love. And we start to notice these patterns, and we push some patterns to the side, and we embrace these new ways of seeing so that we can always see with compassion and love. Next slide. And there are some individual practices that we can do that really help us. Insight meditation, which we teach at the Boundless Love Project, is one of those things. And I can't say enough about how amazing it is to help us come out of our falsehoods, our greed, our judgment, and come into a place of love and compassion, as well as truth, where we see things more clearly. And so I'll send you some resources about our meditation, but there's other ways too. Prayer, there's journaling, and there's time in nature. Whatever works for you to help you touch into that place of love and peace and joy and remain there, go deeper into that. Do whatever spiritual or religious practices you have that help you go there. Or it could be things like yoga, you know, whatever works for you. Next slide. Another thing that I recommend, if you have access to healthcare or to therapy, to try it out. And there are a lot of resources for people who are Black or queer to help you get therapy right now after the uprisings that have happened. So look into those. But this is another skillful means to help us deal with that enemy within, or what some people can say are the colonized mind. You know, we want to get rid of the colonization. We want to decolonize our mind. So therapy, next slide. So those are things you can do individually, but we also need to think about this collectively as a movement. What can we do to help us maintain, like purify our minds and hearts? So we have nonviolence trainings like this one that can help us understand how nonviolence works so that we're more motivated to be kind to our opponents. Next slide. We have role playing. This was done extensively during the civil rights movement. They imagined, you know, we're going to do a sit-in at the Woolworths, and what are some of the likely experiences we're going to have? And then they role played it out. And here we see men blowing smoke in there. So the two women sitting down, or actually in these photos, all the people sitting in the front row are pretending to be sit-in protesters. All the people in the back row are ruffians, white people who are going to be persecuting them for their choices. And so we see this man blowing smoke at her face. We see another man pushing something into her head. Next slide. And they're to do all of this while maintaining the nonviolent creed, to resist without bitterness, to be cursed and not reply, to be beaten and not hit back. So next slide. And here we see them, they're taunting them all, they're name calling them, they're using everything in the book. Next slide. And then finally, they start roughing up this guy. They all gang up on him. Next slide. They grab him, they pull him off his chair, they start hitting him. And they're really just role playing exactly what might happen to some of these people who are going to engage in sit-ins. After they do this, next slide, they do a debrief. They talked about what worked, what didn't work, what could we do better, how could we handle this situation. And they really honed and practiced and learned these skills so that they could maintain nonviolence under pressure. And you also might notice they're all wearing their Sunday bests, because they thought about, like, well, we know they're going to say, I don't want to sit next to somebody who's dirty and unkept. And they said, so we're all going to be showered. We're all going to be wearing our Sunday best. We're going to just address that right from the get-go. And these trainings were so effective that there was one man, David Hartsoe, and he was sitting in a chair. He was a white man. They spun him around, and the guy had a Bowie knife right at his stomach. And he said, I'm giving you 1 minute to get out of here, you N-word lover, or I'm going to gut you. And David said this guy had the most hate-filled rage in his eyes looking at him. And David said to him, well, brother, you do what you have to do, and I'm going to try to love you all the same. And that man, his hand started to shake. He dropped the knife and he left the building. And that is political jiu-jitsu in the moment, showing that sort of courage and love. It can change hearts and minds, even people who are so set in their anger and hostility. And that's the power that we are trying to harness so that we can win this battle. All right, next slide. Movements also use oaths, agreements, pledges, codes of conduct. They go by a variety of different names to help create a sense of, here's what we all agree on. Here's our values. Here's the expectations of behavior that we have for everyone involved. And we have the agreements on anti-oppression. But if you create an affinity group of activists who are working with you on this issue, you can create your own agreements. And it's very helpful. It's a great way to build trust and understanding between you all, to say, hey, what are our agreements? Let's hammer them out. And at the Boundless Love Project, we have our beloved community pledge, which is 10 points that we encourage people to adopt on how to create beloved community. But it's also designed for activists. It's actually based on the 10 principles that King had during the civil rights movement for the members there to sign up for. But we kind of stripped it of a lot of its religious undertones, so it's more inclusive to people of all faiths and those of none. All right, next slide. Singing freedom songs. So freedom songs are great. They show our values of love and compassion. And here we see pipeline protesters doing a soft blockade at a bank, singing a song of pipeline resistance. And it helps maintain our courage, maintain our focus on what we're doing. And so they're really great. And they're great to break out, especially in tense situations, to help de-escalate things. So we've got a variety of freedom songs you can check out at our website as well that we encourage people to use during this movement. Next slide. So those are some things that we can do as a movement to sort of encourage this nonviolent discipline amongst all of us. And then we move on to our last principle, which is the universe is lawful and on the side of love and justice. In this lawful universe, we reap what we sow. If we want to reap peace, justice, love, and compassion, we need to sow seeds of peace, justice, love, and compassion. The ends do not justify the means, as our means must be as pure as the ends we seek. We confidently assert that the universe is on the side of love and justice because love brings health and healing to the body, while committing or witnessing acts of violence often causes our brains to suffer post-traumatic stress disorder. We confidently assert that the universe is on the side of love and justice because all life forms want to be safe, peaceful, happy, and healthy. Next slide. So this principle that the universe is lawful and on the side of justice, first, the lawfulness is there because it reminds us, as long as we're putting love and compassion out into the world, we're doing our job as activists. We are, like, that matters. That is more important than any sort of tactical victory we might gain through some form of secrecy or some form of, vandalism that we're trying to get away from, away with or whatever. Now, granted, if we were living under like Nazi Germany, vandalism is going to have a totally different perspective. It might be safe to spray paint anti-Nazi messages and people to be okay with that because public outcry would be heavily persecuted. A lot of people like Hans and Sophie Scholl were beheaded for just distributing leaflets opposing the Nazi regime. So it's okay in those places. But here in the United States, where we live in a relatively free country, where we have freedom of speech and things like that, it's frowned upon. So we just want to keep putting love and compassion out into the universe, knowing that that is going to make change and be different, and not be so concerned about the tactical victories. And then the second thing we want to realize is that hope and faith are important. That is part of that intangible factors that we need to keep alive. This is going to be a long struggle. We are going to face many defeats. How quickly we bounce back, how quickly we get back into the trenches and move forward is important to the success of our struggle. And so we have to keep hope alive. And we realize that by saying, hey, the universe is on our side. And for many of us, we have to take that on faith at first. But like for me with my meditation practice and starting to see more clearly and starting to get rid of all the judgment and the greed and the hatred, it becomes very clear and very, you can become very confident in the fact that the universe really is on the side of love and justice. And so do that inner work, see more clearly, embrace this, and then also think of hope not as a feeling, but as a verb. As long as you are taking action to create positive change, that is what hope is. Hope is you not giving up. Hope is you still staying in the fight. So keep hope alive that way, if no other way. And for those of us who are spiritual or who have a religion and believe in a God or a higher power of some kind, like tap into that faith of yours because it is powerful, and give your worries to the higher power. Say, hey, this is what I want happen. I'll leave it in your hands and I'll do what I can on my end. There is power there. So this is our one principle that tries to tap into that for everyone. Next slide. So having understood the 6 principles of Martin Luther King and recognizing that they are in this policy level, which is the most important level, every other decision we make about what we do has to be in alignment with these 6 principles and in alignment with the idea of us creating beloved community and stopping line 3. And as we do that, it helps us narrow like what choices we have to make. And it makes it easier to make decisions. It makes it easier for all of us to work together in unity and harmony. And it makes it easier for us to create big wins for our cause. Next slide. So just a quick review of everything we've covered. Dr. King's 6 principles of nonviolence. They are: 1, nonviolence is a way of life that requires courage. 2, the ultimate goal of nonviolent campaigns are reconciliation and the creation of beloved community. 3, we oppose the forces of harm, not the people who cause harm. 4, we willingly accept suffering without retaliation to trigger political jiu-jitsu and benefit our cause. And again, this is going to be huge if we're going to succeed. 5, we purify our minds of hatred, greed, and falsehood while embracing unconditional love for all life. And 6, the universe is lawful and on the side of love and justice. And all of these principles work together as a whole. So if you have questions about one, the other ones typically help to answer that. You can't just pull one out and one out here. They all work together as a whole. Next slide. And if we follow these principles and we commit to vigorous, courageous action, we're going to get increased affections from Enbridge to our side. Next slide. And we're going to shift and grow our power while weakening Enbridge. Next slide. Increasing our chances of victory. And that's what we're in this for. Next slide. And now I want to say a few words about integration. So let's say you've seen this, you're committed to it, you embrace it. Well, how do we integrate this into the reality that we are operating in an ecosystem of Stop Line 3 activism where a lot of people are not working on principled nonviolence. They're just doing the physical nonviolence. So here's what I suggest. First, be the change. Lead by example. Let your example be the witness to this power of this practice. And secondly, model that principle of nonviolence in all of your interactions. So not just with our opponents, but even those people in our movement who you disagree with. You know, can you be loving and compassionate and nonviolent to them as well? When you advocate for principled nonviolence, do so in a kind, polite manner. Don't have judgment for anyone else. Just say like, hey, you know, instead of the sign saying this, which is kind of offensive, what if we have it say this, which shows more of a positive message? You know, be kind. And they might follow, they might not. And that's okay. Just do your best and then let it go. And then 4, this is important, really join or create an affinity group that uses principled nonviolence, because then you'll have your team, you're familiar with them, you know how they operate, what works for them, and you can operate, you can sort of make your own calls. Now, as a movement, we are listening to the leadership of the indigenous people who are spearheading the movement. So we want to always take into consideration their concerns, but principled nonviolence is going to go over and above that. But just be aware, like you want to have some communication with them as well if you're going to be doing some direct actions or civil disobedience. And then 5, treat everyone in the movement with love and understanding. I've said that a lot because it's so important. And then work together when you can and work apart when you can't work together. So don't make it into a big rift or a big fight. Just be like, you know what? I'm feeling like this might not be the best fit. I'm going to work with my own affinity group on this and we'll do it a different way. But, you know, best wishes to you. it'll happen, but there'll be times when everything is seamless and we can all work together. There'll be times when that won't make as much sense. Next slide. So here's some resources for you. If you haven't yet, please visit stopline3.org/take-action. There is a form there to fill out if you want to get more involved, and then people will start plugging you into the movement. Second one. And I'm going to send you these links in an email, so no worries about getting them down. The second one is Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. They have Stop Line 3 meetings. So join a team of volunteers working to stop Line 3, and they're operating in a principled nonviolence approach. So if you're having a struggle finding where you fit in, go there, and you can contact Joe at mnipl.org to get more involved. His email again is joe@mnipl.org. We meet every other Monday night. All right, next. And then we have our nonviolent action resources that you can find at tinyurl.com/nonviolent action resources. Again, I'll send this link to you. And on that link, you'll find the PDF I told you about. It's 25-page on direct or mindful direct action. I also have the slides from last night's training up there, and I'll put the slides from this night's training up there. There's tons more resources. All the names of the books that I've recommended are up there. There's wonderful documentaries showing historical cases of nonviolence to where you can see political jiu-jitsu happening. And there's one about overthrowing a dictator. And they're just using physical nonviolence, but they were able to do it because there was such a massive protest and there were so many people who were fine with ousting this dictator. So check out those resources. They're real great. Next slide. And then visit boundlessloveproject.org/meditate to learn more about developing a meditation practice for you. And this is really what psychologists call a keystone practice. It means that meditation doesn't just benefit you in one area of life, it tends to benefit every single area of your life. So if you are a meditator or if you want to start meditating, check out this resource as it'll tell you how to start or deepen your meditation practice. We have meetings every Tuesday night of group meditation where we meditate together. It's helpful. It's really helpful to do it in community to help encourage your practice. So those are some resources. I'll send them to you. Next slide. And then if you could evaluate this training, that would be great. boundlessloveproject.org/feedback-form. Just take 2 minutes. Let us know what worked, what didn't work, how we could improve it. We always want to make this training worth your time. No, let's go to the thank you. Yep. And I really, really do, from the bottom of my heart, I thank you all for investing your time and attention in coming out tonight and being a part of this training, and for just listening with an open mind and an open heart. And I also want to say I'm very sorry if I've caused you any harm. Of course, my intention is to enrich your life, but I also recognize that intention and impact are different. And so if there have been harmful impacts, please let me know either in the Q&A session, or you can reach me afterwards via email at theboundlessloveproject@gmail.com. And just let me know, because I'm sorry for that. And we have about 12 minutes. I want to open this up to questions and comments from people, and you can either put them in the chat room or you can come off of your